domesticated animals. And the common link was often that human interactions, both directly and indirectly, were causing some of these spillovers. For example, the Nipah virus in Malaysia and now also in India was initially discovered after a fruit bat traveled over the property of a recently deforested farm where pigs ate the bat feces, and humans interacting with the pigs started dying, and it was discovered that Nipah virus was the cause. Today, many viruses are discovered through these ways, and Nipah virus in particular has been found through other means of transmission, particularly in areas that were recently deforested for farmland. For example, a boy in India, I believe last year, was killed after eating fruit that was also eaten by a fruit bat in a property neighboring a forest. Next slide, please. So after we took all different kinds of case studies globally, we decided to finish off this report, and in February 2021, our ABA resolution was passed by the House of Delegates, and it was urging all nations to negotiate an international convention for the protection of animals, and invited the United States in particular to lead those negotiations. And notably, the House of Delegates is not just animal law lawyers, it's lawyers from all areas, and it was overwhelmingly approved and has been discussed as the most ambitious animal law resolution ever to have been passed in the ABA. Next slide, please. But once we got this passed, we started speaking with states and civil society and international organizations. And we were very excited to start getting pen to paper and saying, all right, now draft this treaty. But states were a little bit hesitant to agree to something they can actually see. I think a lot of states and international organizations liked the idea, but it became clear to us pretty early on that we thought a draft would make it a lot more easy for states to see exactly what we were looking for. And in the background at the same time, the WHO pandemic treaty negotiations were beginning. And they're very, very early infancy at that stage. This is about June 2021. So we got together over that summer with our group, with the International Coalition for the Protection of Animals, and started drafting the first treaty. It took many iterations amongst our groups, as well as iterations that have been considered from academia, diplomats, and others who gave comments on the first draft. We met about a year later to discuss the second draft, which was a lot different from the first draft. Our first draft had this idea that we would list species based on how much of a high risk of transmission there were. So some of these were obvious from our case studies, like bats and apes, but others were rather surprising, like parrots. But some of the feedback that we got after the first draft was that scientifically, it made a bit more sense to not limit ourselves to certain animals because the lists were changing every day. And while some animals have a history of transmitting diseases to humans and vice versa more than others, it's not inherently scientifically the case that certain animals have more of a high risk than others. So we took that out. We also had quite a specific first treaty, and our second draft, we decided to make it a lot more vague and focus more on creating a forum for further discussion on animal law issues. As Marcia will explain, we have provisions that provide for further protocols on more specific issues. So our second draft, which is our working draft right now, is a lot more, it leaves a lot more room for further development, but it still has some key protections for animals and would still be quite groundbreaking in the international legal sphere today. Next slide, please. I also want to speak just briefly about some outreach that we've been doing. We've been speaking with states, international organizations, and civil society, both in the context of the CAP, but also in the WHO pandemic treaty, which focuses a lot more on pandemics than our current draft. We decided that it would be best for the WHO to do what they're best at, which is health law, while we focused on more animal law issues. Though our draft still contains provisions relating to the pandemic, and we're still trying to influence the WHO pandemic treaty drafts to ensure that animals are given adequate protection. We've also developed regional teams in 17 jurisdictions since releasing our first draft. We're continuing to grow that. These regional teams are working with governments and civil society in their jurisdictions to further the mission of CAP and to influence the WHO pandemic treaty. And lastly, we've been running the circuit at conferences, particularly on One Health, environmental law, and animal law, to help spread the word to academics and practitioners on what the CAP is and how it can fill some very important gaps in international law, as Marcia and Raj will discuss shortly. All right, handing off to Marcia now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to be sure that you can hear me. Okay. Thank you, Lori. And now I will present the content of the CAP. Well, the structure of the CAP basically has a preamble, substantive provisions, and procedural provisions. For the purpose of this presentation, I will refer only to the preamble and the substantive provisions. Let's begin by the preamble. The preamble will inform us what is the context in which we are drafting this treaty, what is our purpose, what are our principles. We have basically 9 declarations in the preamble. Nevertheless, for this presentation, I will only present 3 of them that I consider them very, very important for understanding the CAP. First, we will understand that this treaty is based on the One Health approach or One Health principle that recognizes interdependence between the health of animals, humans, and the ecosystem. The first, this statement says that the CAP recognizes that the proper treatment and protection of animals and their supporting ecosystems positively impact the public health, biodiversity, environment, and cultural and economic development. A second statement in the preamble recognizes the sentience of the animal dignity, and the moral obligation of humans for the protection. It says that the CAP declared that individual animals as sentient beings have intrinsic value, and therefore their well-being must be protected. A third statement in the preamble established the link between the poor well-being and the zoonosis. We say, recognizing that the failure for account for the well-being of animals is a risk factor for the emergence and transmission of zoonosis. Consequently, with this recognition, we also recognize that this risk can be addressed through a One Health approach if the international community act coordinately addressing public health, animal health, and environmental health. In relation with the substantive provisions that establish what are the state obligations under this treaty, we have 5 fundamental principles, and also we establish the following obligations for the states. Obligations in relation to all animals, obligations in relation to animals under human control, obligations in relation with wild animals, specific obligations to minimize the emergence and spread of pathogens, antimicrobial resistance. What are the obligations in relation to indigenous communities and local communities? And finally, what are the obligations in relation with trade and trade agreements that involve animals? Let's begin for the fundamental principles. We have 5 fundamental principles. The first of them establish that we have a common evolutionary process and heritage with animals, and there exists a coexistence, interdependence between them and us. So the well-being of animals intrinsically is attached to us. We say that animals' individual and collective well-being are integral to environmental protection and conservation. And also, we recognize that we coexist with them in a common ecosystem. The second fundamental principle established the animal sentience, animal dignity, and the ethical obligation of humans. We say that as sentient beings, animals have intrinsic value. Humans have an ethical obligation to act responsibly towards animals. And consequently, it's very important to establish an obligation in relation to not subject animals to cruel acts or unnecessary suffering. A third fundamental principle establishes the obligation, positive obligations for humans when animals are under their control. In this sense, humans have positive obligations to ensure their well-being by providing them an adequate environment and care. A fourth fundamental principle establishes the link between the stress of the animals and how it affects their well-being, their immune system, and this creates susceptibility to contracting and transmitting diseases. And finally, the fifth fundamental principle establishes that protecting global public health requires states to take a precautionary approach in regulating human interactions with animals. Now, what are the state obligations under the Convention on Animal Protection? First, we have established the obligations of the states in relation to all animals without difference between them. So in this case, states have to ensure that animals are not subject to cruel acts or conditions or painful killings. Additionally, states have to integrate the protection of animal well-being into programs and policies, including the environmental, public health, agriculture, education, and trade sectors. States shall develop policy measures to ameliorate the significant adverse impacts on animal well-being. And also, we considered a principle of no regression. This means that states have to ensure that existing policy measures are not weakened or reduced in a manner that negatively impacts animal well-being. Now, what are the obligations under the Convention on Animal Protection in relation to animals under human control? First, states have to take measures to ensure that humans who exercise control over animals will provide suitable and sufficient food and water, provide adequate shelter, provide adequate opportunities for exercise, movement, and socialization, provide an adequate environment for natural behaviors, also provide veterinary services that ensures appropriate health, prevent cruelty and unnecessary suffering, prevent abandonment, and prevent animals from being overworked or forced to exceed their natural capacities and strengths. And finally, during transport, humans and the state have to ensure the well-being of animals. What are the obligations of the states under the Convention on Animal Protection in relation to wild animals? States have to take legislative, administrative, and policy measures to ensure the establishment and maintenance of a system to conserve and protect wild animals within their habitats. And also, they have to promote non-lethal management methods and thus that result in the less suffering of targeted and not targeted wild animals when they have to be killed for whatever reason. Now, also in the Convention on Animal Protection, we have considered specific state obligations to minimize the emergence and spread of pathogens and antimicrobial resistance. First, states have to promote the creation of veterinary services to prevent risk of emergence and spread of pathogens. States have to support the creation of facilities to monitor animals to detect, identify, and prevent the emergence and spread of pathogens. States have to develop guidelines for the detection and management of high-risk practices and locations to reduce the likelihood of the emergence and spread of pathogens. In relation to antimicrobial resistance, states have to prohibit the administration of antibiotics to promote growth or increase yield. Also, states have to ensure the proper separation between species and appropriate health and sanitation for animals and humans in supply chains, trade, transport of animals, live animal markets, laboratories, commercial animal agriculture operations, and so on. And also, states shall facilitate the exchange of information that is relevant to the emergence and spread of pathogens and the related treatment of animals. As we are dealing with the relation between humans and animals, we have to consider also the indigenous communities. For us, this point was very important. We said, whenever consideration is being given to legislative, administrative, and other policy measures that may affect the values, practices, institutions, ways of life, local food sources, or economic development of indigenous peoples and local communities, the states, the contracting parties, shall consult thus affected groups through their representatives regarding the most collaborative and respectful ways to implement this convention. In relation with trade and trade agreements that are trading live animals or parts of animals, we have considered that when a contracting party negotiates a trade agreement with another state that includes trade in live animals or animal parts, both states shall ensure the well-being of live animals and animals whose parts are traded according to this convention. What happens when only one of the parties in a trade is part of the Convention on Animal Protection and the other is not, or have less protection for animals? In that case, where a contracting party trades in live animals or animal parts without states having a legal framework providing lower standards of well-being, the contracting party shall encourage the state to adopt standards consistent with this convention. And finally, we have considered also in relation with trade and agreements, the principle of no regression. And it says that no contracting party shall weaken or reduce its levels of protection for animal well-being as an encouragement for trade or investment. Finally, the last obligation in relation to the Convention on Animal Protection for the states contracting parties, we have considered the technical and scientific cooperation. International cooperation in relation to the cooperation on research and monitoring in the field of animal well-being. States shall work together in relevant fora to promote development of the animal well-being standards in accordance with the best available science. And also, it is important the civil society participation, because academia, non-governmental bodies, national and relevant authorities, indigenous peoples and local communities, and other stakeholders have to have the opportunity to express their knowledge, their experience, their beliefs in relation to the best application of this convention. As you can see, we are trying with this convention to be politically feasible. We are not talking about animal rights. We are focusing in animal welfare, because this is more acceptable for states and governments, and it's very easy in this way to make real this international treaty of animal convention on animal protection. Nevertheless, you can see that we have considered animal sentience, and also we have considered the One Health approach, but not in a relation where we are taking animals and the health of animals in an instrumental way. You can see that we are trying to apply a One Health approach that take the health of animals as at the same time as an end in itself, no? Because I would like to explain this map, you can see in gray that many states doesn't have yet any protection for animals. And I think that they are not willing to do that. And few states are in green that is a very basic protection for animals. So the issue is that we have to find a certain level where all the states, or the most of the states, can arrive to an agreement in relation to the animal protection. And for that reason, we are trying to be very basic and in the obligations towards animals that we are asking for states, from the states. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcia. And I'm going to take this moment to just put the CAP into conversation with a number of international treaties to sort of situate the work that we're doing. And before I dive in, just a note that most of our international protections for animals really consider their interests at the species level, so not as individuals. And so CAP is going to sort of be coming into this particular framework, trying to sort of change the landscape to look at animals and their interests as individuals. So next slide, please. So just as an example, the Convention on Migratory Species of Wild Animals, also known as the Bonn Convention, negotiated in, I think, 1973. It provides for range states for select migratory animals. And those range states are supposed to provide protections for species listed in one of two appendices, depending on whether they're endangered or their status is what is called unfavorable, with international coordination needed to advance their protections internationally among those range states. And CMS provides for migratory wild animals and provides for their interests. So not just animals who move across borders, but more narrowly tailored than that. It only includes animals who cyclically and predictably cross borders, and it doesn't encompass wild animals that are fixed to distinct locales, so who exist within just within one state, whose status is not endangered, or whose habitat might just be destroyed due to development or climate disasters, and for that reason are crossing borders. And so the CAP in Article 5, as Marcia noted, requires that we conserve and protect wild animals and their habitats, so regardless of whether they are migrating across borders. So really, moving into and within jurisdictions, and so not sort of cabined by this requirement that we only protect animals once they sort of cross borders or are likely to cross borders. Next slide, please. Like CMS CITES, or the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, it protects wildlife only in certain contexts. There are certain triggers required, that trigger here being the international trade of species that have been listed on one of three appendices. And CITES also takes no steps to conserve or protect them with regard to domestic trade, regardless of whether they are listed within one of these three appendices. And notably, CITES does offer this sort of single welfare consideration, and that consideration being that live animals shouldn't be transported or be allowed to be transported unless the shipping will be done in such a way to minimize the risk of injury, cruelty, or damage to their health. And this is far short of contemplating their actual well-being interest during transport, which the CAP would require, so go above and beyond. And not just for these endangered or threatened wild animals, but all wild animals and all domesticated animals as well, all those animals necessarily being under human care, as Marcia mentioned. Next slide, please. So the World Organization for Animal Health, formerly known as OIE, now known by the acronym WOA, it provides well-being standards that are based upon sort of sanitary considerations. And those standards are inherently non-binding. So while a treaty did create the World Organization for Animal Health, and the World Organization for Animal Health has created both sanitary and welfare standards, those again are not binding upon states. So you can be a negotiating party or a contracting party to the World Organization for Animal Health, but not actually follow the sanitary guidelines that they provide or the welfare guidelines that they provide. And the way that this works, I'll talk about in a subsequent slide, how there is some effect to this, but what CAP would essentially require and how CAP would go above and beyond is actually providing for certain sanitary standards. Marcia mentioned reducing / eliminating the use of subtherapeutic antibiotics, which we know are used or constitute on the order of 80% of all the antibiotics that are used globally. And it would also prevent the use of prophylactic antibiotics and medicines used for human care, again, to avert the risk of what are called sort of superbugs, or bugs that we will no longer have medical opportunities to provide against. So again, sort of inuring to the benefit of humans, but also necessarily considering the interests of animals. CAP would also go above and beyond some of these requirements by requiring space considerations for animals used in agriculture, also requiring the separation of species, and also requiring that animals be able to engage in natural behaviors, which necessarily provides that we won't be seeing factory farm type, or very intensive factory farm, I should say, type uses of animals in these contexts, at least for states that adopt it. Next slide, please. And lastly, here we have the World Trade Organization, which was created to liberalize trade, to remove discriminatory tariffs and other trade barriers. But what the WTO sort of principal sub-agreement, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, allows for are exceptions to these general rules that prevent states from discriminating against products from other states within their own domestic marketplaces. And what we see here with regard to, or we see some of those here with regard to barriers to protect animal life, to protect human health, and to protect public morals. And in this particular landscape, what we're seeing are states taking some steps to do this, to prevent the import of products produced using methods that threaten global wildlife. And somewhat more recently, public morals, with the EU, Canada, and others having negotiated a treaty, the AIHTS, or the Agreement on International Humane Trapping Standards, to basically create standards around what kinds of traps can be used to capture wild animals whose pelts or fur will be traded among those particular parties. And this, as the title of the treaty suggests, is predicated upon public concern, public morals around the ethics of how we capture some of these animals and the intense pain that's caused to them. And so stepping back, what the CAP proposes to do is to foster more moral standards, more standards that states can use to distinguish between better animal welfare products and lower and worse animal welfare or well-being products. And I think equally as important in this, this pandemic or post-pandemic era, another of the sub-agreements within the WTO framework is the SPS agreement, or the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, which basically incorporates the WOA, or World Organization for Animal Health Standards, as this global norm for states to use to, yes, discriminate against foreign products, but foreign products that are threats to human health, to human consumption. And I'll note here that the SPS agreement states that these standards are floors and not necessarily ceilings. And so states can go above and beyond them. And this is where we also hope that the CAP will advance sort of new standards, more progressive standards, ones that will allow states to ban the import of products that are produced using subtherapeutic antibiotics, which of course is, one of the elements that makes factory farming as we know it today possible. And so with respect to the CAP and with respect to, as of right now, the EU's ban on the import of animal products that do use subtherapeutic antibiotics, we're going to be able to see states taking, affirmative and pragmatic stands against what they will allow to be sold in their markets. So it's not up here, as Marcia noted, but the CAP also encourages states to consider animal well-being standards of other states when entering into trade agreements with them. And she mentioned also this concept of non-regression, so not going backwards as well once you've set a more robust standard, and all of that being sort of critically important economically, and putting the power in the hands of states to enforce and incline other states to raise their animal protection standards. Next slide, please. So the CAP also contemplates protocols that allow states to go above and beyond sort of the fundamental principles and the requirements of the framework treaty. And so these protocols can be either context or species specific. And in order to join the CAP, you have to adopt the convention itself. So you cannot just join one of the protocols. So you have to be, at the time of joining a protocol, you have to be a member of the convention itself. So it's broader in its effect that way. And just in some examples of prospective protocols, some might be standard setting, so cage sizes for certain animals, enrichment requirements, veterinary care for certain animals, also sort of contemplated in the CAP itself, food, water, and rest requirements, but that might also be applied to transport, and states actually setting up more specific standards there. But also, in these contexts where, and these are somewhat low-hanging fruit, but a ban on commercial whaling, a ban on cosmetic testing, foie gras, and these elements of animal use, or these types of using animals that a lot of states, I think Mexico last year, for example, was the 44th or 45th state that had banned the use of animals for cosmetic testing and banned the sale of cosmetic products that had used animals for testing. And so we're already seeing states individually take steps to protect and to provide for the interests of animals. And these could, we believe, provide for the very sort of first and very specific standards or protocols for animals. Next slide, please. And I think Lori, someone spoke to this earlier, but in terms of stakeholders for the CAP, we see animal, environmental, and public health organizations all having a significant interest in what the CAP proposes to advance. And as a starting point, we are really looking towards individual states to develop public support for a convention on animal protection. And what we hope to do in working with regional and state-based ambassadors is to get them to sponsor a conference on animal protection, to bring other states together to negotiate a treaty, with the CAP being sort of the foundational document, the initial draft upon which they will draw upon and improve and again negotiate to develop this first sort of broad animal protection treaty. Next slide, please. So this is our website. You can please go and check out our website. The second draft is not up there yet. You can see the first draft and get a little bit more information on the CAP. The CAP website will be updated in the coming month or two to reflect the new draft once it's finalized. And if you would like to learn more about the convention, if you'd like to contact us, please do so at this email address, and we look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Now, we do have some questions. Greg Morton has said that it was an excellent presentation. What can we do as individuals to help promote the adoption of CAP? What can organizations like the Animal Law section of the Florida Bar do?
Thank you. That's great to hear. I think as of now, the most helpful thing would just to keep following us on LinkedIn, keep an eye on our website. We also have a Twitter page. And hopefully in the future, we'll have more opportunities for individuals or organizations to get involved. Those are in the works, but we're still prioritizing, focusing on finalizing our second draft, but hopefully very shortly we'll be done with that.
And I'll add to that. Once the second draft is finalized, we'll be making it public on our website. And for anybody who in particular is part of an organization that has a vested interest in what the CAP is trying to advance, to please contact us, because we will have a page with organizations who've expressed support for the CAP. And I know part of this question is what can organizations like the Animal Law section of the Florida Bar do? And one of the things that we've sort of realized is that some of these organizations can't necessarily sponsor or support actual laws. That might be something that the Florida Bar, this section, is able to do, but that's one of the things that the ABA was not able to do. It's just not within its purview. But to the extent that putting on events like this, sharing the word, that's really helpful and important. So thank you.
Great. We have a question. Could you touch on what compliance controls and enforcement mechanisms are envisioned for signatories?
I think that we will work as other international treaties. Maybe my colleagues can help me in this, but there is no an international police who will enforce this. So that this will be a question of a state controlling another state, basically. For that reason, we need the civil society. What we need civil society within the countries putting pressure for the enforcement of the Convention of Animal Protection within their own countries. And the governments of these countries will be enforcing the Convention on Animal Protection in the international community. So that is the best enforcement that we can obtain for this international treaty, basically.
We do have a little bit more in the treaty as well, definitely involving civil society. We have self-reporting provisions requiring states to provide yearly reports. I believe it's yearly reports on their progress and how things have changed. We have provisions for information sharing for civil society, additions to those reports. As Marcia mentioned earlier, we also have, I believe our strongest hook as of now is in the trade provision. We can have elements in that provision that would allow states to restrict trade under certain narrow circumstances, depending on the existing trade laws in those countries and globally. But I think that would be the strongest way to enforce this treaty, is if a state is not complying with the treaty, they might be in violation of certain trade laws in accordance with the treaty. But I think it's also that's an important question, and also an important time to mention that this is just a draft treaty. We expect that as it gets into negotiations with actual states, it may change, and things, especially monitoring evaluation frameworks and enforcement frameworks, may be changed as states get their hands on it. But that's what we have as of now.
Thank you very much.
And I'll just add really quickly to that, at least as of the draft currently, there are stipulations for arbitration and negotiations among states who are in disputes. And then that can rise based upon the consent of both parties to an international tribunal. So there are some frameworks in place for that as well. But again, I think, as Lori mentioned, when this goes into the hands of states at the negotiating table, they'll be the ones who determine what isn't within sort of their interests and holding themselves and others accountable.
Thank you. Mark Haynes is asking, did you involve representatives of the ABMA, or American College of Veterinary Preventative Medicine, in the preparation of the CAP?
Thank you for your question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Marcia and Raj, but I do not think that we've been in contact with this organization, but we would absolutely love to. I think having a good handle on the science is super important for this treaty, and we'd be very grateful for any scientific expertise that we could garner from groups like the ABMA.
Great.
Yeah, we have been in contact with physicians and physician organizations, for example, Center for Contemporary Sciences. And so they have all given us feedback on the CAP. But I really want to emphasize that veterinarians play a significant role in in this particular sphere. And so we've also been in contact with veterinarians who are members of the OIE or WOA, and they have given us some of their input as well. And that's been exceptionally helpful. And I would, again, just echo Lori's call for contacting us because, yeah, again, such an important stakeholder group.
Thank you. Heather Miller is saying that she travels to schools throughout Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, and Florida with her employment. And is a presentation like this something that you would be willing to do for law students, or is there something that they can do to assist with your work?
Yeah, I think we would be happy to do this presentation for law students. We've done that before. And we've had professors reach out and ask to use the treaty as a case study for their animal law classes. So definitely something we'd be interested in. As of now, again, we're still really focused, almost single-mindedly focused on finishing the second draft of our treaty at this stage, but we're still thinking up ideas on how we can get others involved in this exciting effort.
Great, thank you. The next question is there a federal level political support for CAP?
Happy to take this one also, but please feel free to chime in. So we've spoken to the State Department and there has been some support, but as the WHO negotiations are still ongoing, it's unclear exactly which role that CAP will play for the United States. But at the same time, we've seen political support for initiatives that have very many similar elements to the CAP. For example, the bipartisan Preventing Future Pandemics Act has received a lot of bipartisan support, and it has a lot of the same ideas, recognizing the One Health principle, which has not been explicitly recognized in international law yet, and other similar things involving the role of animals in preventing pandemics. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll garner more federal political support soon.
Okay, great. And Marcia Cohen is saying that she is on the board of the St. Petersburg, Florida Conference on World Affairs. And she would like to have a presentation on CAP at the conference in February of next year. Who can she contact for that purpose? Attendees would be worldwide.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I would say contact at conventionalanimalprotection.org. That email will go to all of us, and we'd be happy to coordinate with you in organizing a presentation. And certainly by then, I think in the next month or so, we'll have the second draft available. And yeah, again, would be really happy to offer a presentation.
Okay, and if there are any other questions, please put them in the Q&A. I have a question here. Will the CAP have appendices listing high-risk animals that humans should avoid capturing, consuming, selling, and trading? Can you speak to that?
Yes, so in our first draft, we did have the idea of some kind of annex or list that could be ever-changing and have a list of animals that are more strictly regulated than others. But we did away with this idea both based on the science available at the time, and also the idea that it would risk putting targets on certain animals' backs if we identified which ones are most dangerous. So we decided to take that out and leave that more for the states and the convention itself and the conferences and things like that to decide as needed. But as Marcia explained, our provisions right now are more general and leave a lot more room for states to implement what they think would be that should be implemented, both domestically and within the conference of the parties and standing committees and things like that.
And I'll add to it. I mean, that's a great question. And one of the other reasons why we sort of shifted away from focusing sort of exclusively on zoonoses is that there are animal organizations who are doing really great work right now, trying to affect change or bring animals and their interests into the purview of the WHO sort of pandemic treaty negotiations. And so, so it's in some sense not to duplicate some of their efforts, whether that's going to involve appendices I couldn't say for that particular treaty in the negotiations. But yeah, it's a question that is critically important. And so yeah, a number of animal protection organizations and environmental and public health organizations trying to integrate that into pandemic treaty talks.
Okay, thank you for that. And Marcia is asking about the email address, and who will send that to you? Oh, okay. Lori is typing it now.
Oh, I'm typing it into the answer. It's contact@conventiononanimalprotection.org. And you can also find that on our website.
Can you say any more about how you would be involved with animals that are used for scientific research, or can you elaborate on that a little more?
Are you referring to how we will address the animals used for scientific research?
Right.
Well, as you can see, we are not trying to abolish that practices, because politically it will be impossible to make real the Convention on Animal Protection. Nevertheless, we strongly consider that we have to first provide to these animals all the requirements that I mentioned in relation to animals under human control. No, they have to have opportunities to exercise, adequate food, water, shelter, etc. And also, we are considered additionally to these obligations in relation to all the animals under human control. We consider that in research, animals have to be separated, because sometimes in laboratories, we have different species mixed. So that is is a risk factor for zoonosis. And also, we are considered that the states have to ask these facilities transparency, because there is no transparency by these facilities by laboratories, these facilities that are experimenting in animals. It's very difficult to have access to information about the conditions of the animals, the results, what kind of diseases are treating their inside of these facilities. So these are the provisions that we are asking from them.
Thank you for that. Well, that's all the questions that we have. Any last thoughts? Otherwise, I will go over the course number, and thank you all very much. So to get the CLE credit, you need to do that yourself and go onto the website, and the course number is 6550. Again, that number is 6550. And with that, I want to thank our speakers very much and everyone who attended. Thank you so much for being here today. Oh, okay, there is one last question. Is it possible to get a copy of the presentation? And I believe that we will be making PDFs available of the presentation. Is that right?
That's what I understand.
Yeah, we can provide. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Thank you.
much.